All right, so we're going to talk about external IDs and upserts and how we can do upsert with relationships. All right, upsert. What is upsert? Well, an upsert, it combines an insert and an update into a single call. It's a great flexible tool because what it does is that it utilizes something called an external ID to identify a record. Or for that matter, it can actually use the Salesforce ID, but if it finds it, it does an update. If it does not, it does an insert. I'll talk about external IDs in a second. We actually talked about them previously, but let me put off the further discussion for right now. But if the external ID is not matched, then a new record is created. If one is found, then we perform an update. But if multiple records with the same external ID are found, then we throw an error because we don't know which one to update. Okay, so there's three possible conditions which could occur. Okay. So it's very helpful when importing data because it prevents the creation of duplicates if you have a key that we can utilize to identify those records. All right, what would that key be? Well, the key is something that we call an external ID. So going back to our, when we created fields within our objects, one of the things that we did was when we created a field of type text, number, or email, there was an option called external ID. And we were able to identify that a field is an external ID by checking that box. Now, what does that do? Well, by checking that box as an external ID, it does a couple of things. One, it will create a custom index in the database for the values of that field so that we can optimize queries that are looking for, where the ID equals something. The reason that we create the index is that external IDs are used to identify an existing record. So we would be using a lot of lookups in order to find that record. So what's an external ID? Well, an external ID is typically going to be you have some system other than Salesforce. It has its list of keys to identify records. And one of the things that we can do in Salesforce is we don't have to concern ourselves in the external system with understanding what the Salesforce IDs are in order to identify an existing record in Salesforce if we wanted to, for instance, perform an update from the external system to Salesforce. Instead, what we can do is we can take those external IDs, those keys in the external system, and then add them to each record that we're storing in Salesforce, mark it as an external ID. Therefore, when we perform an upsert, what we can do is we can specify, well, when you're performing the upsert, the way I'm going to find, and the way I'm going to determine if the record is existing or not, is based on the value of that external ID field. Okay? So, there's a limit in terms of the number of external ID fields per object. You can have up to 3 per object. Okay. All right. All right. So let's talk about using these things together. Here's the use cases and how you would use these together. So one of the things that we're going to do at Universal Containers is that we are going to have a couple of, you'll see that we're going to have a legacy position number. We'll also have a legacy employee number that I'll talk about in a bit. But the legacy position number is in our so-called legacy system. We would have a key, and that key is what we're going to store in the field called legacy position number. Okay? We're going to flag or mark that field as being an external ID. Okay? Then, when we perform our upserts, we're going to use the value of that field to identify our already existing records. So let's take a look at our legacy system and then our Salesforce.com recruiting app. So over on the left-hand side, we have our legacy system. We have a couple of positions defined within there. Our chief architect and our software developer. Now the key in the legacy system is simply that number, 1 or 2. So we greatly simplified these keys. And over in Salesforce, our records would be identified by our record IDs. In our case, we just used 9 and 10, but obviously those would be our 18-digit or 15-digit IDs, right? And what we've done is we've created a field called Legacy ID in Salesforce. We've marked that as an external ID, and we're storing the key from our legacy system. Any questions about this so far? So, yes?
Can you make it unique?
Yes. So, separate from external ID is the checkbox to, let me go back here to get the exact terminology. So on my, let's see here, let's just go to the position since here's our legacy position number. So one of the things that I can do here is the set external ID and then do not allow duplicate values. Okay, so I could, those are, you might think that they are the same thing, but they're not. Requiring uniqueness and setting something to be an external ID. Those are two separate settings. Okay, so all right. Okay. Oh, showing you all the magic that's going to happen. Okay, so yeah, so I already noted that. So then in our legacy system, apparently we're still using it. One of the things that we did was we went out there and we added 2 new positions, and in addition we also updated an existing position. So for that software developer, we added the letter I onto the end, and then we added 2 new positions, QA and the software developer 2. Now we're going to utilize an upsert over to Salesforce, and we're going to take those 3 positions. We're going to upsert where the external ID is that legacy ID. And so what that's going to do is for the QA engineer and the software developer 2, those are new records. We did not find an existing value with the legacy ID. Therefore, we're going to insert records 3 and 4. But, excuse me?
Is it automatic?
Yes. Yeah. So this is logic that we've written that we perform for you when you do an upsert with external IDs. Okay?
So what if in the legacy application you also updated something and the ID is being used by something else or some other data?
What do you mean used by?
So for example, is this just like one-time data insert? Because I think my question is, let's say in Salesforce you added the QA engineer and software developer 2.
Yeah.
Now in my legacy application I added 3 things. I don't know, president and then QA engineer, software developer 2. Now
Yeah.
my legacy ID would then be 3, 4, 5, which the QA engineer would be 4.
Yeah.
Now it's not matching anymore.
Yeah, so that's a problem. If you have the issue of what's your primary store of data. If you're inserting through Salesforce.com defining new positions, well, we're not going to have a legacy ID. So in this case, I think there's an assumption that the legacy system is the system of record. In the sense that if we're going to define new positions, we should not bypass the legacy system, because then we introduce the possibility that we'll end up with duplicates. Because if we did what you just described, we go into Salesforce, we define the new position, well, there is no legacy ID. We have no idea, one, about the other system, or for that matter, to attempt to generate a key or whatever. So yeah, you'd need to make sure that in this case you want to retain the legacy system as your system of record.
In that case, Chris, wouldn't the onus be upon the legacy system to provide legacy IDs if we port that data back over, just as when we're porting data over into Salesforce, the onus is upon us to give those unique IDs. It's not the other system. So we're responsible for our IDs as they're responsible for their legacy IDs. You don't want to take their logic or their algorithm and try to have that.
Definitely. So they're in charge of their IDs and we're in charge of ours. We can use theirs, but never do we generate theirs.
Can we update it?
Can we? Sure. It's a field. Yeah. So we could change that legacy ID, but then we're getting, now we're kind of playing with fire. So, all right. Okay, so so we're able to use that legacy ID of 2 to identify that record and then perform the update. Okay. All right, now not only are we able to do this on a single object type, but we can also do this, utilize that external ID when we're doing an upsert with relationships. Okay. So let's say that not only do we have legacy IDs for positions, but we also have legacy IDs for our users. We have legacy IDs for, or I'm sorry, external IDs, I shouldn't say legacy. External IDs for our users. We have external IDs for our job applications. Well, we can use the external IDs to define the relationship between these two sets of records, all right? So when you're inserting, for instance, let's say I'm inserting a job application, I'm sorry, I should say I'm doing an upsert of a job application, and when I'm upserting my job applications, I'm not only using the old job app ID, which would be my external ID, I'm also defining the relationship to existing position and candidate records using external IDs on those. Okay? So I don't need, like in the lower example, I don't need to figure out what is the Salesforce record ID for my positions and candidates. I can simply use the external IDs to define the relationship.
But you need for both.
Yeah, in this case, for both.
Position and candidate, you would need the external ID from the legacy system to know how to.
Yes. Yeah. So I need the, well, I need some, yeah. So I need the ID from the external system to do this. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the benefit here is there's no need to have sort of a two-step system. The two-step system would go, okay, I know, I need to go do a lookup on the candidate to determine its Salesforce ID. Then I need to decorate my data and replace, the external ID with the Salesforce one. So I don't have to do that. All right. So who did I leave off on? I think John, it's your turn. What is the advantage of performing upserts rather than creates or inserts on large data sets?
Well, I guess the upsert performs both the create and the update.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure what the advantage would be there.
Well, the big thing, whether it's large or not, is the possibly introducing duplicates. So if you have something that already exists, you want to use the upsert so that you don't introduce duplicates. So an insert will just blindly say, yep, let's insert another candidate who also happens to have the exact same demographic information.
So it will automatically look for existing records based on what?
Based on the external ID.
Yeah, so you specify what you want to do, but typically you're saying, okay, the definition of what an existing record is based on that external ID, that field that's marked as an external ID. So, and you could do something like, create a field that is a calculated external ID. So you might do something with some Apex code and go, okay, I'm going to create a text field, and it's going to be, I'm going to mark it as external ID, and I'm going to populate that. I'm going to take the person's email address and their phone number, and something like that. And then I'm going to append those two things together, and that's my key. So you can manufacture a key. So. How do you make a field an external ID? Kevin, boy, that's a
tough one, huh?
Yeah.
Can I use the little hand?
You can do Murat's.
Go to the field definition.
For those not seeing Kevin right now, he is doing the classic checkbox motion. So you would check the box, okay? Do you have to know the Salesforce IDs of records in order to use upsert with relationships? Carol.
You have to know the external ID?
Yes, you do not need to know the Salesforce IDs. So you can simply know the external IDs or use the external IDs. Yes, question?
So for each object, you're allowed to have up to 3 external IDs?
Yes.
And it gives you the capability of saying that you can have duplicates.
Yes, if you don't use that, yeah, you could have non-unique external IDs. Yeah.
So if you're loading that data, does the system check all those external IDs to see if they're unique or not unique based on those rules?
Well, it's going to, so if you mark it as just an external ID and you do not require uniqueness, you do not check that box. As long as you're using upsert, you will not introduce any duplicates because it's going to find it and then do an update as opposed to an insert. But if you started doing inserts, now you have the possibility of having multiple records with the same external ID value.
And it'll kick it out?
No, it will not kick it out. It'll allow that. So it's now in the database.
So based on so you can combine all 3 external IDs in an upsert record, and as long as it meets the rules that you've defined, it'll be fine.
So wait a minute, what did we just say there? If you set all 3 external IDs,
and they were consistent with your rules about duplicates or uniqueness or non-uniqueness, then you're cool. But
well, remember what we said back on Monday. And what we said back on Monday was when you're using that upsert, you can only reference a single field as being the field to use. So if your definition of uniqueness is actually based on 2 fields,
no, they can be different. I'm just saying that when you're doing upserts from an external source, you have to declare which external ID you're going to use or not.
Yes, you have to declare which single field is the one in which you are uniquely identifying those records. Yeah.
And just so I'm understanding, if you do an upsert, you're okay because it will kick out duplicates.
For that field, yeah.
For that field, for that one field. If you're doing straight up inserts, you will get duplicates.
If you did not check the checkbox that I did, which was exactly so, if you did not check the checkbox, do not allow duplicate values, then yes, you will. You're doing an insert. You're saying it's okay to have duplicates, and that's what it's going to do.
Even with upsert. Okay, I was just trying to say.
With okay, now you just said even with upsert. The original question was if I do an insert. So my answer was for insert. Now if you do an upsert and you identify, then even if this is not checked, it will follow the logic that I had back here, which was, let's see if I can find that. So let's take a look at this. So regardless of whether uniqueness is checked or not, if I'm doing an upsert, it says if the external ID is not matched, then do an insert. If it is matched once, do an update. In other words, it will not create a duplicate.
Right.
If it's matched multiple times, then that's an error. We don't know what to do. We return an error for that record. Sure. Yes.
So is there any mechanism to handle deleting of data from your legacy that may have occurred, trying to keep the two systems in sync? Is it something you'd have to write some code on the legacy side to send a delete message to Salesforce, or is there a way to automate that somehow through the interface?
No, I mean the delete is a separate call, and yeah, you'd need to delete and I'm trying to think if you can do a delete based on the external ID. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, so I'm trying to keep the two in sync, and my system of record is maybe my legacy side, and so when it deletes a record, it's not going to be in my upsert file because it's gone. But it's still going to exist in Salesforce. So how do I get rid of it in Salesforce? Is that just going to have to be an automated process?
I think what you'd probably like to do is a delete where you're referencing the external ID over in Salesforce, and let me look that up to see if we support that. Okay. So, all right, but yeah, you'd have to link that up. All right, let's move ahead here.
Not only see if it is possible, but also watch for the logs that you have in Salesforce, because there are some things, some objects that even via Apex you can probably delete based on the legacy system that has been logged. So even though it's not possible.
Oh, you're saying, for instance, in an approval process, we lock the record. That presents a problem. Yeah. So.
So is that a database log or just an application log? I mean, would API get around it just because it wouldn't check it?
It's the lock. I can tell you this: when you're logged in as system administrator, it bypasses the lock. So it's not a. I guess the way you defined it, it's an application lock, as opposed to the database actually having a lock on that row. So so that, I guess that would be a consideration, is that, so.
For more information on Salesforce.com training and certification, please visit www.salesforce.com/training.